UNESCO has been working for a number of years on issues around artificial intelligence, impact on science, on culture, and of course on education. Generative AI that has hit the global awareness since late last year has added a whole new dimension to our work, especially on education. And I'm very privileged to be joined today by Professor Stuart Russell, a researcher in computer science at Berkeley University in the US. His research covers AI, but also it has an emphasis on kind of long-term future of artificial intelligence in relation to humanity. Professor Russell, thank you very much for joining us. The first question I have is, your work has been focusing on longer-term societal change due to artificial intelligence, including generative artificial intelligence. Of course, that's quite a difficult thing to predict, what societies will look like in the future. The technology is changing, there are other factors that are changing the world. What implications does that have for education systems, which notoriously evolve quite slowly? And how should society be preparing young people through education?
Well, those are a pair of difficult questions with very long answers. So let me start by separating this question, what's the impact on education, into two parts. One is what impact it's going to have on the purpose of education. What are we educating people for? And then the second question is, what impact does it have on the methods of education? Does AI have a role to play in actually educating students? So if we think about the purpose of education, we're going through a period of very rapid change. And as you said, our education systems are not noted for their agility. I remember when I was a student at Oxford in the late 70s, they had just approved a geography degree 125 years after it was first proposed. It literally took that long to approve the degree, by which time, satellite mapping had more or less completely obsoleted vast areas of geographical study. So if we think about a time when AI reaches its long-term goal, which is to create general purpose AI systems that are able to do everything that human beings can do, and probably do it much better, much faster, drawing on much vaster sources of knowledge, and so on. That's going to be a very different world. So what will, if we're starting to think about educating people for that world, you have to think about, what are people going to be doing? Are they going to be writing computer programs? Chances are they aren't, because we're already seeing AI systems that can do a pretty good job of writing routine computer software instantaneously, simply for the asking. And I think this is only going to improve very rapidly. This is probably, in economic terms, one of the areas with the biggest impact in the short term for generative AI. So the idea that we should start training people to be computer programmers is probably completely the wrong direction. It might be necessary in the very short term, but I think longer term, it's likely that all routine forms of physical and mental labor will be automated. And that's the vast majority of jobs that exist in the world. If you ask, what are people going to be doing? I think they're going to be in largely interpersonal roles, where they're interacting one-on-one with a relatively small number of other people, but doing so, at least in part, as a professional in that role. So if we think about childcare as an example of that, what do we pay people who do childcare, right? I mean, we have babysitters with maybe €10 an hour, and anything you need from the fridge, you can eat it, right? And this is despite the fact that our children are our most precious, the most precious thing in our lives, and yet we're entrusting them to someone that we pay €10 an hour to. Why is that, right? I would say my children are more precious than my leg, but if I need my leg fixing, I go to a doctor, and in the US, I'm paying them €20,000 an hour to operate on my leg. Why is that? And the answer is because it's very simple. We pay the surgeon a lot because the surgeon is very good at what they do. And they're very good at what they do because we've invested vast amounts of money in medical research over centuries. And we've also invested a lot of money in training the surgeon to take advantage of all that knowledge. It works. And that's why, because it adds value, right? My babysitter when I was growing up tried to teach me to smoke when I was 7 years old. It's not clear that that was adding value at all. So here's the thing. If you want these interpersonal roles to add value, to actually improve each other's lives in a professional way that's based on training, that's in turn based on scientific understanding, then we need to have scientific understanding and we need to have training. We don't have either of those things right now. So that suggests a huge shift in the focus of our scientific research towards understanding, what makes a human life worth living for a given human being, because it's not one size fits all, it's one size fits one person, right? For a given human being, what are the interventions that will improve their lives? When and how do we deliver those interventions? For parents, when and how can they access advice on how to bring up each of their children in a way that's going to be helpful rather than harmful, right? These are all questions that we simply don't know the answers to because we haven't done the science. So we have to do the science, we have to create the professions, the curricula, the training, the credentials. All of that takes a long time. That's the impact I think that AI is going to have, or one of the impacts it's going to have on our education system, is to completely change why we're educating people.
So education systems today, should they be teaching computer science? Should we be taking an entirely different approach? What are the skills that we should be inculcating into young people today?
So I think right now in most economies there is a shortage of computer scientists, data scientists, and so on. So it's entirely reasonable that children who are in high school or in college may want to get training in those areas because there's an economic need. Also because computer programming is an excellent way to learn how to think carefully and correctly. Just as arithmetic. I mean, we don't actually use long division anymore, but the teaching of long division is really about teaching people to carefully execute a sequence of steps without making a mistake, which is a useful skill for all kinds of things, from repairing cars to writing computer programs and so on. So think of all these as forms of mental training that build up certain strengths. But if I think about a child who's just starting school at the age of 4 or 5 right now, do I think that in 20 years' time there's going to be a significant need for computer programmers, software engineers? It doesn't seem that likely. It's hard to predict the time scale. Some people think general purpose AI will be here in 5 years' time. I think it'll be longer than that. And the time scale does matter because you've got to figure out, okay, well, when do we want this change in our education system to actually click into place and be ready. Because if it's not ready, then we're going to have several decades where everything we've taught people is useless, and there'll be underemployment or unemployment on a massive scale that will be societally extremely harmful. So the second part of your question, and I did warn you that these questions had long answers, right? The second part of the question, how will AI actually play a role in education? So putting aside the question of what are we teaching and why are we teaching it, how are we teaching it with AI, is potentially really exciting. So let me first of all put to one side the question of AI systems doing homework for children, for students in college and so on. Yes, that's happening. No, it shouldn't happen. Any more than teachers should do all the homework for their children, right? There's a reason why it's called homework. It means you're supposed to do it. It's work you're supposed to do, and you're supposed to do it at home. And having someone else do it all for you defeats the purpose. So this is, we will figure out ways of ensuring that that real work is done by students and not simply passed off to AI systems. And I think people who draw the analogy between electronic calculators and general purpose AI systems, I think that's a completely false analogy. Because first of all, we generally don't let kids use electronic calculators until they've learned the basics of arithmetic. Second of all, the cognitive skills that electronic calculators automate are almost the opposite of thinking. So I mentioned long division. Does anyone actually know why we do the things we do in long division? Why do you move this number down and then do a short division with this number and that number and put the number up here? I don't think very many people actually understand why the mechanics of long division works correctly. It's just a recipe. So that's a very basic form of cognitive activity, and automating it doesn't preclude students from understanding mathematics. And in fact, we want a lot of that stuff to be put to one side so that we can really focus on the concepts of mathematics. If you use a general purpose AI tool to do all of the work that you're supposed to do as a student, then of course you learn nothing, right? For example, writing essays, the purpose of writing essay is to learn to think clearly and express yourself clearly. If you simply automate that and have the AI system do it, then you're not learning to think, and that's really a problem. And so we cannot have an education system where students are simply learning to use AI systems as a tool, and that's all we teach them, because then you're not allowing their minds to develop properly. And so what should we be using AI for? I think is to have the same effect that an expert human tutor can have. And expert human tutors are very rare because they're extremely expensive, right? If you think you're basically employing a full-time human being, adult, who's well-trained per child. And so that type of tutoring is very rare. Even at Oxford, which is a very well-endowed university, you only get to see your tutor in pairs and only for an hour a week, right? But here we're talking about someone who might work with a child for 6 hours a day, 5 days a week. Economically, it's impossible, but we know experimentally that it's incredibly effective with children of all learning styles, all abilities, and all levels, because the human tutor can adjust to exactly what that student can do, how they learn. So if we can replicate that, then we can have an education system that's on the order of twice as effective as the one we have now. So if you think just in very simple terms, that means children reaching a college level of capability and understanding by the age of 11 or 12. That would be revolutionary, and presumably, I think most people would say, a very positive change.
This question of personal tutoring is much touted as one of the main advantages of generative AI. UNESCO convened a meeting of ministers of education earlier this year, and it was something that was cited over and over again, the potential to expand education opportunity, particularly for developing countries. How close are we to having models that can do that? Because currently the models are trained to answer questions. How soon do you think we will have models that will be able to do personal tutoring, and how do you see that integrating into current educational practices as they stand today?
I've already seen examples of so-called Socratic tutoring language models. And so why do language models answer questions in the first place? It's because we've specifically trained them to do that. So a language model is built in several phases. The one phase is the most well-known phase. You shovel in billions of words of text, and you're training it to predict the next word given the previous few thousand words. And they get very good at that. That doesn't produce a particularly helpful system. It's just as likely to say, oh, I'm too busy, go ask somebody else, right? So we teach it to be a helpful question answerer by having thousands of people simulate conversations where one person is the human and the other person pretends to be the machine and answers questions in a very helpful way, polite way, not using bad words and not exhibiting various kinds of stereotyping and all the rest of it. And that training phase produces the systems that we see, ChatGPT and others, where when you ask a question, it'll give you an answer. If you give it an essay prompt, it'll produce an essay for you. That's not what a teacher does. If a pupil in the class says, "Can you do my homework for me?" the teacher will say, "No, of course not. Your homework is for you to do." So you have to not train it that way. You have to train it where one person is pretending to be a student and the other person is being the teacher. And if the student says, "Oh, I'm stuck," then the teacher's supposed to be helpful in getting the student unstuck, and not say, "Well, hard luck, try harder," or something like that, but actually to be helpful, but not so helpful that the student doesn't learn how to do it. So that process is more difficult, I think, than just question answering. It's also, I think, harder to recruit tens of thousands of people who can effectively play the role of a teacher in that setting. And then the other unknown question is, what kinds of failures will we see with those systems? We know with the question answering systems that there's at least two kinds of failures that we've observed already. One is hallucination. You'll ask it a question. It doesn't memorize all of its training data. This is important to understand. So a typical large-scale system might have 1 trillion parameters, but be trained on 30 trillion words of text. So it simply cannot remember all of the text that it's seen. But it sort of has a feeling that it knows the answer to everything. And so I'm saying has a feeling in quote marks here. And so you ask it questions, it will just spout complete nonsense as an answer very confidently. This is called hallucinating, and that's a real problem in many, many real applications. You literally cannot trust it to tell the truth. So you need a human being to check. If it's critical that it be correct, you can't leave it to a machine. Another problem is called sycophancy, where it's been trained to sort of agree with the user. So you can ask it, what's 1 and 1? It'll say 2. And you say, "Really? Are you sure it's not 3? And it'll say, "Oh, of course, you're right. It's 3. I apologize for the mistake in my reasoning." Right? This is sort of what we call sycophancy, right? It bends over backwards to agree with the user and so on, which is not something that you want to have happen in a teacher-student interaction, right? You don't want the student to say, well, I think my answer's right, and this teacher says, oh yes, of course your answer is right and mine was wrong, and right, that wouldn't work very well. So it's early days yet, but I think there's probably pretty good potential to get a decent tutor that will adjust to some degree to the learning style and capabilities of the individual student and can handle relatively simple material. I think people are overestimating the capabilities in terms of understanding really complicated content. They see these claims that the systems have passed, the bar exam for lawyers, or they've passed the entrance exams for various universities, and they've done well on various math tests and so on. That does not mean that they're good at understanding mathematics. One of the reasons they pass these exams is because they've seen hundreds of copies from previous years of the same exams with the answer sheets and whole books on how to pass the exams. And often they're successful basically by regurgitation rather than understanding. And when you probe more carefully, you often find that actually there's a complete misunderstanding of the content of the system. And that presumably increases as you go up the curriculum to more and more difficult material. So I think it's going to be very much an experimental question for what part of the curriculum is this effective, how good are we at training an educational system rather than a question answering system.
There is a lot of focus on primary and particularly secondary education, but of course higher education and research also plays a role. And again, there's two parts to this question, how AI will affect higher education and research. But perhaps a more interesting question at this stage is also what research should we be doing in terms of AI from a scientific perspective, but also from a social science perspective?
So I think it's interesting. I mean, there are many different branches of research that are going to have to collaborate on these questions. And one of the things that's going on is that we're running a giant experiment. It started, I think, with social media, but at least in social media, you're mostly interacting with other human beings, just through a different medium. But now, and going forward, billions of people will be spending many hours a day interacting with a computer directly. And what effect does that have on human development, psychological state? Does it create emotional dependency? Does it create a sense of impotence because the machine is so all-knowing and so on? We don't really know answer to these questions, but just looking at other experiments. So when we deprive people of human interaction, we know that leads to extreme pathological states, often even a failure to develop language at all. And so we're doing an experiment that's sort of comparable in severity on billions of people with no IRB approval. So to really understand, and I suspect what we're going to find is actually, for some people in some circumstances, quite harmful effects. And so to avoid those effects, we're going to have to understand much more about human cognition. We've sort of got by without understanding human cognition well because the cognitive inputs to human beings have been, for millions of years, coming from other human beings, and that's what we evolved for. And so that's sort of a natural state. But now we've got these tools that allow us to change that dramatically. And all of a sudden, we need a much more precise understanding of human cognition to make sure that that's actually safe and beneficial and not harmful. So that's one part of this. Another part is preparing people, so doing the science of how to, as I said before, how to enable an individual human being to have a rich and fulfilling life. Particularly in the absence of all the economic and social structures that have evolved over thousands of years that we've all sort of grown used to. And they're not perfect at ensuring that people have rich and fulfilling lives, but we accept that they work well enough. So as many of those get swept away, particularly the sort of the world of work may disappear for many people. How can we ensure that nonetheless people have rich and fulfilling lives? And this depends so much on the individual that we need a type of science that's very much a precision science of individual cognition, individual well-being and happiness. That science doesn't exist. So this change, the focus of our science for so long has been on the physical world and the biological world of our bodies in medical research, and not very much on our minds. And the mind is very, partly is because it's just a very difficult thing to study. But this is what we have to do.
Professor Stuart Russell, thank you very much for coming and sharing your thoughts with us today at UNESCO.
It's been a pleasure, Claire. Thank you.